the choir was touched by the Spirit this morning. Thank you so very much. Our reading this morning is from Cornel West, who is a writer, public intellectual. I'm not exactly sure I know what that means. I guess opposed to a private intellectual, I don't know, but he's a public intellectual, and he bounces back and forth all the time between Princeton and Harvard and Princeton and Harvard. So I guess one of the duties of a public intellectual is to offend whatever institution you are in, and so he goes back and forth. The last I heard, Cornel West was now at Harvard Divinity School, and working with, amongst the rest of the faculty there, with Terry Tempest Williams. And I can imagine what a powerhouse Harvard Divinity School must be these days. I will always call to my heart, many, many years ago, Cornel West came to Salt Lake City. He gave a lecture and offered to have breakfast for the clergy, just for the clergy, the following morning. Well publicized. And I got there plenty early because I wanted a good seat, and only 5 clergy showed up. I don't know what that says about the clergy here, but the other 4 were very, very shy, I guess, so I consider it my breakfast with Cornel West. I will remember it always. So what we want to do this morning is really understand the man, Dr. Martin Luther King, a little bit more keenly. And Cornel West, I think, is going to kind of grease the wheels on that. He starts off, the chapter dedication, they always have quotes at the beginning of chapters, and the one that he uses to introduce his piece is a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "Life is a continual story of shattered dreams." Life is a continual story of shattered dreams. He would know. In the last days of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. was haunted by the pervasive and poisonous threat of nihilism. King's best friend and lifelong comrade, Ralph Abernathy, noted, quote, "He was just a different person. He was sad and depressed." His close confidant, Andrew Young, reported, and I quote, "In the later years, he was given to a kind of depression that he had not had earlier. He talked about death all the time. He couldn't relax. He couldn't sleep. He was spiritually exhausted." And King's longtime friend, Dorothy Cotton, said that, quote, he was just really emotionally weary as well as physically tired. The whole last year, I felt his weariness, just weariness of the struggle that he had done all that he could do. And recently, in a heartfelt speech at the annual conference for the American Academy of Religion in San Antonio, Texas, Jesse Jackson talked about his last group meeting with King, in which King declared he was going to either leave the movement or fast unto death in order to unite the movement. By nihilism, I mean to denote a suffocating condition of spiritual blackout that shatters the human capacity to experience love, find meaning, gain access to hope. For King, nihilism is the ultimate nightmare, the stark opposite of his dream of the beloved community. This monumental wrestling with the nihilistic threat to King's life and witness had much to do with his deep sense of vocation and the immense weight of his increasing perception that America was, quote, from King now, a sick, neurotic nation, unwilling to be truthful about itself. King's profound embrace of responsibility for the morality and efficacy of nonviolent resistance and the intense entrenchment of the liberal status quo led him to say to Abernathy, maybe we just have to admit that the day of violence is here, and maybe we have to just give up and let violence take its course. The nation won't listen to our voice. Maybe it'll heed the voice of violence. King's devoted and brilliant wife, Coretta Scott King, wrote, he was very depressed. And I kept trying to tell him, you mustn't hold yourself responsible because you know you aren't. And in an unusual tone and temperament, King told his family friend, the Reverend D.E. King, I have found out that all I've been doing in trying to correct this system in America has been in vain. The whole thing will have to be done away with. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome not only everyone, but especially welcome those who are new to our First Unitarian Church, and hopefully you will hang around for coffee hour following the service and make your way right here to the welcoming table and learn a little bit more about the congregation. I just have a couple of really brief announcements. One is a reminder. In fact, please take a look at all the announcements because they're all very important in the life of this church. But just of immediate concern time-wise is that tomorrow there will be a film here at noon, a film that gives a little bit more history and background of the Freedom Riders, a discussion to follow, and then, of course, a big meeting at East High School and the March. So that's going to be tomorrow. And then on Tuesday at 7 o'clock in our social hall, Elliott Hall, we're going to have this, Monica and I together will share a fun time, hopefully an educational and enlightening time for those who are kind of new to the church, or maybe brand new or sort of new, to learn a little bit more about Unitarian Universalist history, its theology, a little bit more about this church. It's really a great opportunity for us to get connected and to learn a little bit about this Unitarian Universalist experience. So that's on Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. Hope that you're able to attend. The offering will now gratefully be received, a chance to greet one another and wish each other a fine good morning. It's been 52 years since Dr. King's assassination. After all this time, the complexity of this enormous figure in American history still makes it hard for us to figure out just who he really was. We tend to remember Dr. King as a man of great hope, leading the civil rights struggle with his eloquent gift for oratory. We like to recount his influence upon our nation when he shared his dream, a dream where black children and white children would one day live in mutual respect and freedom would ring equally for all God's children. Contrary to the message of other black leaders at the time, calling for more violent action to bring change to a resistant nation, Dr. King, we are mostly taught, offered a more temperate approach to change. This image of Dr. King sacrificing his life for racial equality by showering unconditional love upon everyone, even upon his jailers and tormentors, is now woven into the tapestry of our nation's civil rights story. But that's far too simple a story. For a clearer and deeper understanding of Dr. King, it's important that we place black leadership into some kind of an historical context. But where do we start? For W.E.B. Du Bois, who served as Dr. King's spiritual mentor, as well as being the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard in 1895. Du Bois begins tracing black leadership back to what he called the Revolution of 1876. 1876. Now, that year may not mean much to many of us, but it marked the end of Reconstruction. So by putting the historical pieces together, we have the Civil War, emancipation, and then a very surreal time in American history when about 6,000 former slaves suddenly find themselves as freed men with basic human and civil rights intact. But they're still in a hostile environment. No longer legally considered as chattel serving their masters, slaves were now free to begin navigating their own lives as free people who even had the right to vote. But the commitment to protect black rights didn't last long. By 1876, the drive to intimidate and repress black voters began to pick up steam. And despite President Grant having sent federal troops to the South to ensure the right to vote, these troops left in 1876, following a compromise in a contested presidential election. And so emancipation was short-lived. The taste of freedom lasted but for a fleeting moment. By 1876, our nation had once again resumed its white supremacy policies, which meant black disenfranchisement, at a time when the black population believed that their prayers for freedom had finally been answered. In this abrupt change back to the old status quo where racism dominated, African Americans looked for leadership to help prevent losing more ground in their rights to secure the privilege as free men. They wanted to preserve their dignity. So black leadership wrestled with how best to reestablish hope for a recently freed bunch of slaves who are now suffering repression once again. The trick, it seemed at the time, was to somehow rework the ideals of freedom in a form, some form, any form, that would seem less repugnant to the white South. In other words, leadership was consumed by how best to play the game, given the yearning for freedom in a hostile climate. Two basic leadership styles emerged. One represented by Booker T. Washington, who said that he felt the spirit of the times, and he claimed that black suffrage may not come to pass. But he urged that the black population take the low-hanging fruit and better their lives economically. He argued that African Americans need to surrender, one, their political power, two, their insistence on civil rights, and three, higher education for black youth. In exchange for this obvious concession of civic inferiority, the black population could then insist on higher wages, become property owners, and attend schools to learn trades. Now, the white South liked Booker T. Washington because submission to white people was still essentially intact. It seemed a perfect compromise. Blacks could enhance their standard of living without posing any threat at the ballot box. But the question that just dangled out there pertained to, well, black dignity. W.E.B. Du Bois argued that self-respect was worth more than owning land and houses. He felt that conscience was bound to ask the nation three things: the right to vote, civic equality, and the education of all youth according to ability. So from the beginning, black leadership goals differed on strategy, measuring compromise over and against dignity. And then, of course, another variable thrown into the mix were the black leaders espousing revolt and revenge and immigration to practically anywhere outside of the United States. Now, there is much that weighs upon black leaders historically. Logistical tactics were significant, but there was also the need to take a kind of spiritual pulse of where the sentiments of the black people really lay. Were they hopeful about change, or were they resigned to a future of continual poverty and despair? Was the movement making progress? And of course, what did progress even look like? It should come as no surprise that Dr. King felt the same tensions as had affected all black leaders before him. And he despaired greatly in hearing the drumbeat of change not coming fast enough. Our reading this morning offered a glimpse of Dr. King's despair when he confided to a friend that the nation won't listen to our voice. Maybe it will heed the voice of violence. Wow, can you imagine that? I mean, if Dr. King got to that point in his thinking, he was clearly suffering a crisis of hope. Patience among the oppressed grows weary after a while. The issues confronting Dr. King were undeniably reminiscent of the era when Booker T. Washington tried to sway his people with compromise. Washington felt that compromise was a better alternative to risk losing everything in a battle that he thought we were never going to win. And yet Du Bois felt that black people needed to just rock the foundations of this racist nation. Dr. King, in fact, was moving closer to what Du Bois contended, and Malcolm X reconfirmed some 60 years later, that in this country, black people could not bring about change through non-violent means. And so as we gather here today, 52 years after the King assassination, we're staring at a white nationalist government doing its illegal utmost to suppress minority votes. Many writers today who are revisiting the King legend contend that King had an inkling that this was going to happen one day. There's too much evidence that he deeply questioned the nonviolent strategy. And meanwhile, the FBI sent tapes to both Dr. and Mrs. King highlighting his infidelity and calling for him to commit suicide. Dr. King was betrayed by his friends in the movement, many of them strongly objecting to his Poor People's Campaign and its strident opposition to the Vietnam War. Dr. King's friends, and what they call movement comrades, were abandoning him for lucrative careers of their own. They trashed him to gain mainstream acceptance, or just dismissed him as an outdated leader. Christian ministers closed their pulpits to him. His nonviolent message was accepted by fewer and fewer people. Young black leaders leaning more towards violence walked out on King during his address at the New Politics Convention in Chicago, 1967. Members of SNCC booed and heckled him as he preached at Liberty Baptist Church, also in Chicago, in 1966. King's leadership, summarized as love-driven activism, was heavily challenged by the Black empowerment movement. As was historically consistent, dating back to Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, the Black movement was split in one of two ways. Either some of the Black population felt that violence was justified in the face of unending denial of their rights by the white establishment, or secondly, some African Americans who gained a foothold in mainstream society wanted to disassociate themselves from any Black protests. I liked this part when Dr. King got pretty snarky in his message to middle-class Black people when he said, "Your attitude may get you a foundation grant, but it won't get you into the kingdom of truth." Truth, for Dr. King, transcended Black oppression. Truth could not afford to be selective as to which injustice to embrace. So as Dr. King publicly proclaimed his vehement opposition to the Vietnam War, the fallout was just devastating. The Washington Post published an editorial that slammed King for doing grave injury to his people. The message viciously contended that by alienating the white power structure, like Lyndon B. Johnson, King diminished, and I quote, his usefulness to the Black struggle. That's from the Washington Post. Life magazine wrote that King put forward demagogic slander that sounded like a script for Radio Hanoi. In a recently published volume of essays on the political philosophy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it became quite apparent that self-doubt permeated the soul of this great and courageous leader. If we can just try to imagine his mindset after countless rallies, demonstrations, and jail time, with very little changing on the social landscape of Black poverty and incarceration, we can understand his lament shared with some of his confidants. He wondered whether or not he was, in his terms, advocating integration into a burning house. Integration into a burning house. He asked, what if nonviolence simply did not work? He confessed that maybe he was wrong about the long arc of the universe bending towards justice. Maybe Christian theology was no match for Nietzsche's realities of power and violence. Now, it's really hard for us to contemplate all of this because it runs so contrary to the King image and message that we celebrate this weekend. But the sermon that he was scheduled to preach on the Sunday following his assassination was entitled, "Why America May Go to Hell." Now, we prefer believing that Dr. King's revolution was a revolution of the heart, a change in America's values, not a condemnation of our country teetering on the hopelessness of hell. Why America may go to hell. You know, it makes me wonder what he actually did see on the metaphorical mountaintop. Could he discern a decline in our culture, a downward spiral leading to where we are today, led by a white nationalist in the White House? I shudder when I read historian David Garrow quoting Dr. King as follows: "I don't have any faith in the whites in power responding in the right way. They'll treat us like they did our Japanese brothers and sisters in World War II. They'll throw us in concentration camps. The Wallaces, the Birchites will take over. The sick people and the fascists will be strengthened. They'll cordon off the ghetto and issue passes for us to get in and out." This is Dr. King speaking. Dr. King speaking from the depth of despair. Lionel McPherson, the African-American philosopher at Tufts University, lays down a framework for understanding King's primary concerns, which made it increasingly difficult for him to sustain hope. King felt 4 walls closing in on our country: militarism, materialism, racism, and poverty. Closing in. Now, for King, the rejection of militarism was not tied to a particular foreign policy issue like Vietnam. Instead, he saw an American empire becoming a way of life. He warned of an intimate connection between guns and butter, this connection between strong military policies and weak anti-poverty programs. Isn't that what Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have been saying throughout the whole Democratic presidential debates? I mean, they reiterated over and over again the direct link between cutting the military budget in support of health care for all, universal education for 3- and 4-year-olds, ending the student debt, free public college, on and on and on. It's that link between this military empire and anti-poverty programs. Now, King was trying to connect those dots half a century ago. Far too few people understand Bernie and Elizabeth in the same way as far too few people could ever comprehend Martin for what he was really saying. In Cornel West's essay on philosophy and race in America, he writes, "For King, the vicious legacy of white supremacy, be it directed towards indigenous peoples, Asians, Latinos, or black folk, is as American as cherry pie. In regard to values and government's close money ties to big business and Wall Street, King would say it leads to a war against the poor." William Rutherford, executive director for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, wrote that King confided in him when he said, "Obviously, we've got to have some form of socialism, but America's not ready to hear that yet." We will soon find out if America is ready to hear the need for some kind of socialism in today's world. In the 1903 publication of The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, which will serve as our first book in our African American Writers series resuming in March, Du Bois speaks about a very difficult word. And that word that he just churns over again and again, that word that he wrestles with is hope. And juxtaposing hope with his views that America will probably never rise in response to the poor, he refrains from saying hopeless and instead injects the term unhopeful. He's not hopeless, he's just unhopeful. What a clever nuance. And so he says, I am unhopeful in a land whose freedom is to us a mockery and whose liberty is a lie. Well, this pathos represents an American legacy inherited by Dr. King. It filled him with anguish because he felt that as a leader, he never really moved the needle. And today's writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates addresses the same white supremacy assumption, but Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't do so as a leader of a movement, but merely as a writer delivering advice to his son and all black children, advice on how to survive, just to survive as a black person in America. And Coates published his book the same year that white nationalists demonstrated their might in Charlottesville, Virginia. And today, we find ourselves less than 24 hours from state militias from all over the country, ready to descend on Richmond, Virginia, heavily armed with guns and hatred and white supremacy, ready to intimidate a legislature that has finally endorsed gun control for the state of Virginia. And our president has added fuel to the flames of hatred by condemning Democrats for taking away people's rights to their guns, their constitutional right. He made no call for calm heads to prevail. Will 2020 be the year America wakes up and comes to its senses? I want to conclude with an African American understanding of the word soulcraft. I know how many of you know the word soulcraft. It's basically about rejecting superficiality, like consumerism and flawed ideals about what success means. Just forget about all that in favor of soulcraft. Now, Cornel West, in a speech given recently at Yale, said that soulcraft has everything to do with attending to the things that matter, not the things on the surface. It's the cultivation of thinking critically for yourself so you are willing to speak in such a way which is clear speech, frank speech, fearless speech, speech that flows from your soul, not to show that you're clever and smart, but to show that you are courageous and wise. Dr. King personified soulcraft. Despite his anguish and despair, his doubts and trials, he spoke to us, all of us in this nation, from the depths of his soul. He was courageous. He was wise. And you know, we have heard neither a voice nor vision that comes close to what Dr. King brought to this country, what he sacrificed, because he believed that a condition of truth is to allow the suffering to speak and the voices of the vulnerable be heard. Who in 2020 will speak clearly, frankly, fearlessly from the depth of his or her soul? Who will attend to the things that really matter? So be it. Can we close our service this morning? Turning your hymn books, please, to number 95. Dr. King surmounted his despair with a deep sense of calling. He died after living a fairly lonely life of monumental sacrifice and service. Although Dr. King may be elevated and celebrated today, he remains widely misunderstood. As he said himself, "I am greatly saddened that inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling." Amen.